My name is Sarah, and this is the story of how my parents spent $150,000 on my brother's dream life, only to regret every single penny a decade later. It's a story about favoritism, shattered dreams, and the harsh reality that money can't buy success or happiness. Growing up, I always knew my brother Marcus was the golden child. He was charismatic, confident, and had this way of making our parents believe he was destined for greatness. Meanwhile, I was the quiet one, the responsible daughter who got good grades and never caused trouble, but invisible. When Marcus turned 18, he announced he wanted to be a professional photographer and travel the world. Not just any photographer, mind you. He wanted to capture remote indigenous tribes, document endangered species, and have his work displayed in major galleries. It was an ambitious dream. My parents were immediately on board. My father, a successful accountant, saw Marcus as the creative soul he never got to be. My mother viewed him as her masterpiece, the child who would live the extraordinary life she'd always imagined. I was starting community college at the time, paying my own way. The spending started innocently enough. They bought Marcus a professional camera setup, lenses, tripods, lighting equipment. $10,000 right there. Then came the laptop, editing software subscriptions, and a workshop with a renowned National Geographic photographer. Another $8,000 down the drain. But they were just getting started. Marcus convinced them he needed to build his portfolio with international experience. So they funded a 3-month trip to Southeast Asia. Flights, accommodations, permits, insurance, spending money, $25,000. I was eating ramen noodles in my dorm while my brother was posting Instagram photos from Thailand and Vietnam. When he returned, Marcus had thousands of photos but no real plan. My parents didn't care. They were mesmerized by his stories and his mediocre images of temples and street food. They started talking about him like he was the next Sebastian Salgado. I rolled my eyes so hard I nearly sprained something. Marcus decided he needed a vehicle for his photography adventures. Not just any car, but a customized van that he could sleep in and use as a mobile studio. My parents bought him a brand new Sprinter van and paid for the conversion. $40,000. I was driving a 15-year-old Honda with a broken air conditioner. The pattern continued for years. Every time Marcus had a new idea or needed funding for another trip, our parents opened their wallets. Ecuador to photograph cloud forests, Iceland for the northern lights, Morocco for desert landscapes. Each expedition cost between $15,000 and $30,000 when you factored in everything he claimed he needed. Meanwhile, I graduated from community college and transferred to a state university. I worked 2 part-time jobs while taking a full course load. When I graduated with my degree in nursing, my parents came to the ceremony but left early because Marcus had an exhibition opening that same evening. 6 people showed up to his exhibition. I got my first nursing job at a local hospital and moved into a tiny studio apartment. I was proud of myself for being independent, but part of me resented how hard I had to work for everything, while Marcus just had to ask. Our parents justified it by saying I was practical and didn't need help. Marcus was now in his late 20s and still hadn't made a single dollar from his photography. He had no regular clients, no gallery representation, and his social media following was stuck at around 2,000 people, mostly friends and family. But he always had an excuse and another big plan that required more investment from our parents. He decided he needed formal education after all, despite having rejected college years earlier. He applied to an expensive photography program in New York City. Tuition for the 2-year program was $60,000. I laughed when I heard, certain our parents would finally say no. I was wrong. They paid for the entire thing up front. My father took money from his retirement account. My mother went back to work part-time despite having health issues. I was furious. I called my mother and asked why they never helped me with my education. She said Marcus needed it more because he was finding himself and I had always been self-sufficient. The favoritism was no longer subtle. During this time, I met David, a respiratory therapist at my hospital. We fell in love and got engaged after a year of dating. When we started planning our wedding, I kept it modest because we were paying for it ourselves. My parents contributed $2,000 and seemed proud of their generosity. I didn't have the heart to tell them. Marcus finished his expensive program in New York with a portfolio that looked remarkably similar to what he'd created on his own. He moved back home, claiming he needed to regroup before launching his career properly. He was 30 years old, living in our childhood home rent-free, with our parents still paying for his equipment, his van insurance, and his cell phone bill. David and I bought our first home, a modest 2-bedroom house that needed work. We were excited despite the renovations we'd have to do ourselves. My parents came to see it once, spent 15 minutes walking through, and my mother said it had good bones. Then she showed me photos of Marcus's latest project, photographing abandoned buildings in Detroit. The turning point came on Thanksgiving when Marcus was 32 and I was 30. Our whole family was gathered at my parents' house. Marcus spent dinner talking about his newest idea, a coffee table book about American ghost towns. He needed funding for a 6-month road trip to photograph them. He estimated he needed $40,000. I watched my father's face as Marcus presented his proposal like a business pitch. Dad looked tired in a way I'd never seen before. He was 68 years old and should have been thinking about retirement, not funding another one of Marcus's schemes. But I could see him wavering, ready to say yes again. I didn't back down. I pulled out my phone and did the math right there at the dinner table, listing every expense I could remember. The initial equipment, the trips, the van, the school, the living expenses. I calculated they'd spend at least $150,000 on Marcus's photography dream. Probably more, considering everything I didn't know about. Then I asked what they'd spent on me. My $2,000 wedding contribution? That was it. In my entire adult life, they'd given me $2,000 while giving Marcus enough to buy a house. I asked if they realized how unfair that was. My mother started crying. Marcus called me jealous and bitter. Dad just stared at his plate. My father called me 2 days later. He asked if we could meet for coffee. I agreed, curious about what he had to say. When I arrived, he looked older somehow, deflated. He apologized for never acknowledging how hard I'd worked or how unfairly they'd treated me. He said he'd been blind to it until I forced him to see it. He explained that he and my mother had always worried about Marcus. He seemed so directionless, so fragile in his sense of self. They thought if they just supported him enough, he'd find his footing and succeed. Meanwhile, I seemed so capable, so independent. They convinced themselves I didn't need them the way Marcus did. It was a terrible excuse, but at least it was honest. I told him that by constantly rescuing Marcus, they'd ensured he'd never learn to save himself. They'd created a 42-year-old child who couldn't function without their money, and they'd taught me that love was conditional on how much you struggled. The more independent I became, the less they felt they needed to show they cared. Dad admitted I was right. He said he'd told Marcus no about the ghost town project. It was the first time he'd ever refused one of Marcus's requests. Marcus hadn't taken it well, accusing them of giving up on him and not believing in his talent. He'd been giving them the silent treatment for weeks. My father looked heartbroken. Marcus moved out of our parents' house and got a job at a camera store. He was bitter about it, viewing it as beneath him. But slowly, something started to change. He began teaching photography workshops at the store on weekends. He actually enjoyed it and was good at it. Real income started coming in, modest but his own. Meanwhile, David and I announced we were expecting our first child. My parents were overjoyed and for the first time seemed truly present in my life. My mother helped me prepare the nursery. My father started researching college savings plans for the baby. They were trying to make amends in their way. It meant more than any check would have. One evening, about a year after the Thanksgiving confrontation, Marcus showed up at my house. He looked uncomfortable but determined. He asked if we could talk. I invited him in, curious about what he wanted to say. We sat in my living room, and for the first time in years, we had a real conversation. He admitted that the last year had been brutal for him. He'd been angry at everyone, especially me, for exposing the truth at Thanksgiving. But working at the camera store and teaching had given him perspective. He realized he'd been living in a fantasy funded by our parents' guilt and his own manipulation. He'd never actually had to make his artwork economically. I asked him if he regretted his path, all those years of chasing photography. He thought about it and said no. He loved photography, but he'd gone about it all wrong. He'd treated it like something owed to him rather than something he had to earn. Now, teaching at the camera store, he was actually helping others discover their passion while supporting himself. He still took photos on weekends and had started a small business doing portraits for families and graduating seniors. Nothing glamorous, but it was sustainable. He said he felt more proud of the $5,000 he'd earned this year than all the expensive trips and equipment our parents had bought him. He was learning what I'd always known. There's dignity in earning your own way. My daughter was born that spring, a healthy baby girl we named Emma. Both my parents and Marcus came to the hospital to meet her. Holding my daughter, looking at my family gathered around, I felt something shift. The resentment I'd carried for so many years started to loosen its grip. We couldn't change the past, but maybe we could build something better. My parents started a college fund for Emma, contributing monthly. They did the same for Marcus's future children, making it clear they'd learned from their mistakes. They were trying to be fair, to do better. It wouldn't erase the $150,000 they'd spent on Marcus or the years they'd ignored me, but it was something. One day, my father pulled me aside during a family dinner. He told me he and my mother had been doing their finances and realized that their retirement savings had taken a serious hit from all the money they'd given Marcus. They'd likely need to work a few more years than planned. He looked ashamed admitting it. I felt a complicated mix of emotions hearing this. Part of me wanted to say, "I told you so," but mostly I just felt sad for them. They'd sacrificed their own security for what they thought was helping their son, and it had bought nothing but dependence and disappointment. They'd robbed Marcus of the chance to grow and themselves of a comfortable retirement. But here's what surprised me. I offered to help them. Not with money exactly, but with planning. I helped them create a realistic budget and timeline for retirement. David and I committed to checking in on them regularly and being there if they needed anything. After years of feeling like the forgotten child, I chose to be the responsible daughter they actually needed. 2 years after that explosive Thanksgiving, our family had transformed. We weren't perfect, and there were still moments of tension and old resentments, but we were more honest with each other. My parents acknowledged their mistakes openly. Marcus was building a real life instead of chasing fantasies, and I was learning to forgive, slowly but surely. The story of the $150,000 became something we could actually talk about now. My mother admitted she'd known at the time that it was unfair to me, but she'd convinced herself that she was doing the right thing. She'd been so afraid of Marcus failing that she'd prevented him from ever really trying. Her regret was palpable. My father confessed that he'd lived vicariously through Marcus, seeing in him the artistic freedom he'd never allowed himself. By funding Marcus's dreams, he thought he was correcting his own life's regrets. He realized too late that he was projecting his own unlived life onto his son and ignoring the daughter who was actually living well right in front of him. Marcus opened up about how the constant financial support had actually paralyzed him. He'd never had to make his photography work because he'd always known our parents would catch him. When they finally stopped, he was terrified and angry. But that fear forced him to figure out what he actually wanted versus what sounded romantic and impressive. One weekend, Marcus invited me to attend one of his photography workshops. I was skeptical but went to support him. I watched as he patiently explained camera settings to beginners, encouraged a shy teenager with genuine talent, and made photography accessible and fun. He'd found his calling, just not in the way anyone had imagined. He was a teacher, not a traveling artist. After the workshop, we went for coffee and had one of the most honest conversations we'd ever had. I told him I'd been jealous of him for years, watching him get everything while I struggled alone. He said he'd always been jealous of me too, of my certainty and competence. my ability to build a real life without drama or delusion. We'd both been looking at each other. He asked if I thought our parents' money had ruined his life. I told him no, but it had delayed it significantly. Without the constant financial support, he might have figured out his path much sooner. Or he might have found a different path entirely. The money gave him the illusion he was succeeding, when really he was just spending. It kept him comfortable in his failure. Marcus got quiet, then said something that surprised me. He said the worst part wasn't the wasted money or lost years, but the damage to his relationship with our parents. They'd been enablers more than supporters, and he'd let himself become entitled and ungrateful. He'd turned them into ATMs and himself into a perpetual child. That realization hurt more than any professional failure. As Emma grew into a curious toddler, I watched my parents with her and saw them trying to apply their hard-learned lessons. They encouraged her, but didn't overwhelm her. They praised effort over talent. They were determined not to create another golden child or another invisible one. They were trying to love both their children and now their grandchild without the toxic favoritism that had poisoned our family. On Emma's second birthday, my parents did something unexpected. They sat Marcus and me down and gave us each a letter they'd written. In mine, they apologized formally for all the ways they'd failed me, for every time they'd chosen his dreams over my reality, for every accomplishment of mine they'd minimized or ignored. They listed specific incidents I thought they'd forgotten. The letter acknowledged that they couldn't give me back the money or the years of feeling secondary, but they wanted me to know they saw it now, all of it, and they were deeply sorry. They said I'd become an incredible woman, not because of their support, but despite their neglect, and they were more proud of me than they'd ever properly expressed. Both letters acknowledged that they'd failed as parents in opposite but equally damaging ways. They'd abandoned me to independence before I was ready and kept Marcus's dependent long after he should have been independent. They'd corrected in real time too late, but they wanted us to know they recognized their mistakes and were trying to make amends. The letters meant everything. That evening, after Emma's birthday party, the four of us sat on my back porch while Emma played in the yard. We talked about money and family dynamics and the ways parents can love their children while still harming them. It was uncomfortable and emotional, but it was real. We were finally being honest with each other after decades of pretending everything was fine. My father said that if he could do it over, he would have given both of us equal support, financial and emotional. Or better yet, required both of us to earn our way while being there for genuine emergencies. He said the $150,000 they spent on Marcus would have been better spent on their retirement or split between both children for down payments. My mother added that she wished she'd been braver about telling Marcus no earlier. She'd seen he was taking advantage of their guilt, but she'd been afraid of disappointing him or damaging their relationship. Ironically, enabling him had damaged their relationship far more than boundaries ever would have. She'd learned that real love sometimes means letting your children struggle and fail and figure it out. Marcus spoke up then, his voice thick with emotion. He said he wished he could give back all that money, not because he didn't appreciate it, but because he would have been a better person without it. He'd spent his 20s and early 30s as an overgrown teenager playing at being an artist. Now, at 35, he was finally growing up, and it was embarrassing and painful. I surprised myself by reaching over and squeezing his hand. I told him that while I'd been angry for years, I was proud of who he was becoming now. It takes courage to admit you've wasted time and opportunities, to start over and do better. He was doing that. He was facing reality and building something real. That mattered more than the lost years or wasted money. The conversation shifted to lighter topics eventually, as difficult conversations do. But something had fundamentally shifted between the four of us that day. We'd acknowledged the truth of our family's dysfunction and everyone's role in it. The favoritism, the enabling, the resentment, all of it was finally in the open. And somehow, that made it possible to move forward. Over the next few years, our family found a new equilibrium. My parents retired, later than planned, but comfortable enough with some adjustments. Marcus got married to a woman he met at the camera store, someone practical and kind who loved him but didn't indulge him. They had a small wedding they paid for themselves, and he seemed proud of that. David and I had a second child, a son we named Jack. Marcus's wife became pregnant around the same time. Watching our children play together at family gatherings, I felt grateful that they'd grow up with cousins and grandparents who'd learned from their mistakes. They wouldn't bear the burden of being the golden child or the forgotten one. They'd just be kids, loved equally. Marcus continued teaching photography and had grown his portrait business into something sustainable. He wasn't rich, but he paid his bills and took pride in his work. More importantly, he developed work ethic and business sense. He understood now that success isn't about talent or opportunity alone. It's about consistency, professionalism, and meeting people's actual needs, not your own artistic vision. One day, Marcus called me with exciting news. A local art gallery wanted to display some of his photographs in a group show. Nothing huge, just a small exhibition with several local artists, but he was genuinely excited, and I was happy for him. I went to the opening, and for the first time, I looked at his work without resentment clouding my judgment. His photographs were good, not earth-shattering or revolutionary, but good. They showed real skill and perspective. But more than that, they showed authenticity. These weren't photos from expensive trips to exotic locations. They were images of our town, our people, the ordinary moments that make up real life. They were honest in a way his earlier work never was. He'd found his voice. That night, driving home from the gallery, David asked me if I was still angry about the $150,000. I thought about it. The anger had been such a constant companion for so long. But honestly, I wasn't angry anymore. I was sad about the years we'd all lost to dysfunction and favoritism, but I wasn't angry. We were all trying to do better now. I told David that the money was never really the point. It was what the money represented my parents. Belief that Marcus was worth investing in and I wasn't, but they'd realized their mistake and were making amends. Marcus had grown up and taken responsibility, and I'd built a life I was proud of despite everything. We'd all survived our family's dysfunction and come out better for it. The years continued to pass. My parents aged as parents do. Marcus and I became closer, bonding over the shared experience of parenting and the weird complexity of family history. We could joke about the old days now, the van and the trips and the exhibitions no one attended. The pain had faded enough that we could find the absurdity in it. On my 40th birthday, my parents gave me a check. It was for $75,000, half of what they'd spent on Marcus all those years ago. I started to protest, but my father stopped me. He said they'd been setting aside money for years, wanting to balance the scales as much as they could. It wouldn't make everything equal, but it was something. I cried holding that check, not because of the money itself, but because of what it meant. They'd heard me. They'd recognized the injustice and tried to correct it. David and I used the money for Emma and Jack's college funds and some long overdue renovations on our house. Every time I walked through my updated kitchen, I thought about forgiveness and family and second chances. Marcus had mixed feelings about our parents giving me that money. Part of him felt guilty, knowing it came from realizing how much they'd favored him. But he also understood it was necessary. He said it helped him feel less burdened by the past. They'd tried to make it right, as much as anyone can make such things right. The scales weren't perfectly balanced, but they were closer. When my father was diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's a few years later, it was Marcus and I together who helped our mother navigate the diagnosis and treatment options. We divided responsibilities based on our strengths. I handled the medical aspects, researching doctors and treatment plans. Marcus handled the emotional aspects, spending time with Dad and keeping his spirits up. We were a team. One afternoon, sitting with my father while he dozed in his favorite chair, I thought about the $150,000 and what it had cost our family. Not just in money, but in relationships and self-worth and years of resentment. It had been an expensive lesson for everyone involved. But maybe, in the end, we'd all learned something valuable from it. My father woke up and looked at me with clear eyes. He said my name, then asked if I'd forgiven him. I told him yes, I had. I'd forgiven him and Mom for the favoritism, for the years of feeling invisible, for everything. He cried then, and so did I. We sat there together, father and daughter, finally free of the burden of old wounds and regrets. He told me he'd made so many mistakes as a parent, but his biggest regret was not seeing how strong and capable I was until it was almost too late. He'd been so worried about Marcus that he'd taken me for granted. He said that if he'd known what real success looked like, he would have recognized that I was the successful one all along. I kissed his forehead. Marcus came by later that evening. Dad was asleep again, and Marcus and I sat in the kitchen talking quietly. He said he'd been thinking about the $150,000 a lot lately. He wondered what his life would have looked like if our parents had said no from the beginning. Would he have grown up sooner? Been happier? Found his real path earlier? I told him there was no point in wondering. We can't rewrite the past. All we can do is learn from it and do better going forward. He was doing that. He was teaching his own children about responsibility and work ethic. He was being the kind of parent who encourages dreams, but also teaches the skills needed to achieve them. That was what mattered now. Marcus nodded, then said something that surprised me. He said that, in a weird way, he was grateful for how things turned out. The money and the enabling had nearly destroyed him. But hitting rock bottom at 32 had forced him to rebuild himself properly. If our parents had kept funding him, he might still be chasing impossible dreams and calling it art. He said the best thing they ever did for him was finally saying no. It was the hardest and most painful gift, but it was the one that actually helped. All the money they'd spent before that had just delayed his growth. The moment they stopped giving was the moment he started becoming who he was meant to be. Sometimes love means withholding, not providing. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, two siblings who'd taken very different paths but ended up in similar places. Both of us had learned that success isn't about talent or funding or opportunity. It's about showing up consistently, doing the work, building something real. Those lessons can't be bought, only earned through experience and often through failure. As I drove home that night, I thought about my own children. I thought about how David and I would raise them, what lessons we'd teach them. We'd encourage their dreams, but also teach them the value of earning their way. We'd love them equally, support them fairly, and let them struggle when struggling would help them grow. Emma was 13 now, showing interest in veterinary medicine. We were encouraging her passion, but also teaching her about the education required, the work involved, the reality of the career. We weren't going to hand her anything, but we'd help her build the skills she needed to achieve her goals. That's what good parenting looks like. Jack, at 11, was still figuring out his interests. He loved music and computers and sports. We let him explore without pressure, knowing he'd find his path eventually. But we also made sure he had chores, responsibilities, and understood that privileges were earned. We were giving him structure, not just dreams. He was learning accountability early. The following year, we gathered for Thanksgiving at my house. It had been over a decade since that explosive dinner where I'd confronted my parents about their spending. The family sitting around my table now was different, better. We'd all grown. The wounds had healed, leaving scars but also wisdom. We knew each other better, loved each other more honestly. During dinner, Emma asked her grandfather about his photography days. Marcus laughed and told stories about his ridiculous van and the time he tried to photograph bears in Alaska without proper permits. We all laughed together, able to find humor in what had once been painful. My father smiled, his memory still mostly intact for now, enjoying his family. After dinner, Marcus pulled out his phone and showed everyone his latest project. He'd been documenting small business owners in our community, creating portrait series that told their stories. The local newspaper had featured his work, and several businesses had commissioned pieces. It was modest but meaningful work, and he was genuinely proud of it. So were we all. My mother squeezed my hand under the table. She whispered that she was grateful we'd all made it through those difficult years and come out stronger. She said she looked at both her children now and felt proud of who we'd become. Not because of what she and Dad had done, but because of what we'd done for ourselves. That acknowledgement meant everything. Later that evening, after everyone had gone home and the kids were in bed, David asked me if I ever regretted how things had played out. Did I wish my parents had given me money too, back when I was struggling through college and early adulthood? Would I have chosen differently if I'd had the financial support Marcus received? I thought about it carefully. The truth was complicated. Part of me would always carry some resentment about the unfairness of it all, but another part of me recognized that struggling had made me who I was. I'd learned self-reliance, financial responsibility, and the satisfaction of building my own life. Those were gifts, even if they didn't feel like it at the time. I told David that I wouldn't change the past even if I could, not because it was fair or right, but because all of it, the pain and resentment and unfairness, had led to this moment. To our family now, healed and honest and better than before. To the lessons we could teach our children. To the relationship Marcus and I had built. You can't pick the good without the bad. The $150,000 had been a costly mistake, but it had taught everyone in our family invaluable lessons. My parents learned that love without boundaries is harm. Marcus learned that handouts prevent growth. And I learned that being overlooked doesn't mean being worthless. We'd all paid a price, but we'd all gained something too. That's the messy truth of family. A few months later, my father's condition worsened. The Alzheimer's was progressing faster than we'd hoped. Marcus and I took turns staying with our parents, helping our mother manage Dad's care. In those quiet hours sitting with my father, I realized that the money didn't matter anymore. What mattered was being present now, showing up, being the family we'd all learned to become. One lucid afternoon, my father called both Marcus and me to his bedside. He wanted to talk to us together. He said he'd been thinking about his life, about the choices he'd made as a parent. He said the $150,000 was the worst money he'd ever spent. Not because Marcus didn't deserve support, but because of how they'd done it. He said they'd confused enabling with supporting, indulgence with love. They'd given Marcus money when what he needed was guidance, boundaries, and faith in his ability to figure things out. And they'd given me nothing when what I needed was acknowledgement, encouragement, and the knowledge that I mattered just as much. They'd failed both of us in different ways, and he was deeply sorry. Marcus and I both assured him he was forgiven. We told him about the lives we'd built, the lessons we'd learned, the ways we were breaking the cycle with our own children. We told him that his mistakes had ultimately made us better, stronger, more aware. It wasn't the path any of us would have chosen, but it had led somewhere good. That had to be enough. My father smiled, then tears in his eyes. He said he was proud of both of us, not for what we'd achieved professionally, but for who we'd become as people. For our kindness, our resilience, our willingness to forgive and grow. He said that was worth more than any amount of money or success. That was the real measure of a life well lived. Love and growth and redemption. He passed away peacefully 3 weeks later, surrounded by family. At his funeral, Marcus and I both spoke. We talked about his strengths and his flaws, his love and his mistakes. We were honest because that's what he would have wanted. The $150,000 came up, not as a source of shame, but as a cautionary tale about good intentions and unintended consequences. In the months after Dad's death, our family grew even closer. Shared grief has a way of burning away the superficial and leaving only what matters. Marcus and I supported our mother through her loss. Our children grew closer to their grandmother. We had weekly dinners, built new traditions, and honored Dad's memory by being better to each other than we'd sometimes been in the past. One evening, about a year after Dad's death, Marcus and I were going through old photo albums at Mom's house. We found pictures from our childhood, from those years when the golden child and the invisible daughter dynamic was just beginning to form. Looking at those young faces, I felt compassion for all of us. We'd all been doing our best, even when our best wasn't good enough. We found photos from Marcus's various trips, the ones funded by that $150,000, Thailand, Vietnam, Ecuador, Iceland, Morocco. The images were technically competent but hollow, lacking the authenticity of his current work. They were the photos of someone playing at being an artist rather than actually being one. We could see the difference now, even if we couldn't then. Marcus laughed, looking at a picture of himself next to his converted van. He said he looked at that period of his life with such mixed feelings. Part of him cringed at his arrogance and entitlement, but part of him was grateful for the journey, even the wrong turns. Without going down that path, he might never have found the right one. Sometimes, you have to get lost. As I write this story now, years after that explosive Thanksgiving dinner, I'm struck by how much has changed. My parents regretted spending that money, not because Marcus didn't deserve support, but because of how it poised our family dynamics and stunted his growth. Every penny of that $150,000 carried a hidden cost none of us understood at the time. Money isn't neutral. The story of my brother's dream life, funded by our parents, is a cautionary tale about favoritism, enabling, and the complicated nature of family love. It's about learning that the best gift you can give someone isn't money, but the belief in their ability to figure things out themselves. It's about boundaries and fairness, and the courage to say no when yes would be easier, but harmful. Today, Marcus runs a successful photography school. He teaches not just technical skills, but also business sense, professional ethics, and realistic expectations. He tells his students about his own journey, including the years he wasted chasing fantasies funded by other people's money. He's honest about his failures because he knows they're more valuable lessons than his successes. He's finally become the artist he pretended to be. I'm still working as a nurse, now in a management position at my hospital. I love my work and take pride in what I've built through my own effort. Emma is in college now, studying biology on a partial scholarship she earned through her own academic achievement. Jack is in high school, still figuring out his path, but learning to work hard and earn his way. I'm proud of them both. My mother lives independently still, though we check on her frequently. She volunteers at a literacy program and seems at peace with her life. She said many times that if she could do it over, she'd handle everything differently. But she also acknowledges that we all survived our family's dysfunction and came out better for it. She's learned to forgive herself, and we've learned to forgive her. The $150,000 is gone, spent on a dream that never materialized the way anyone imagined. But in its place, we have something more valuable. A family that knows itself, loves honestly, and has learned from its mistakes. We have relationships built on truth rather than illusion. We have children who understand the value of work and the importance of fairness. That's worth more than money. Sometimes people ask me if I'm still angry about the money, about the years of favoritism and being overlooked. The honest answer is no. I've made peace with it, not because it was fair or right, but because holding on to anger was hurting me more than anyone else. Forgiveness isn't about forgetting or excusing. It's about choosing to move forward without the burden of resentment. I've chosen to move forward. Marcus and I have a tradition now. Once a year, on the anniversary of that Thanksgiving dinner where everything came to a head, we meet for coffee. We talk about how far we've all come, the lessons we're still learning, the ways we're trying to be better. We remind each other that family is complicated and messy, but worth fighting for. We toast to second chances and hard-won growth. This year, at our annual coffee, Marcus told me he'd finally paid back our parents. Not the full $150,000, but what he could afford over the years. He'd been setting aside money monthly, and he'd presented our mother with a check for $50,000. She'd cried and tried to refuse, but he insisted. It was important to him to give back something after taking so much. He said it wasn't about the actual money, it was about the principle, about taking responsibility for the ways he'd taken advantage of their guilt and love, about acknowledging that their enabling had been partly his fault too, because he'd let it happen. He'd been complicit in his own stunted development. Making that payment was his way of closing that chapter and moving forward with a clean slate. I told him I was proud of him, and I meant it. The Marcus sitting across from me was so different from the entitled 32-year-old who'd pitched his ghost town project at Thanksgiving a decade ago. He'd grown into a responsible adult, a good father, a successful business owner, and a genuinely decent person. The journey had been painful and expensive, but he'd made it. He'd become real. As we finished our coffee, Marcus asked me what I thought the real lesson was in all of this. What would I tell someone whose parents were making the same mistakes ours did? I thought about it. I told him the lesson was simple but hard. Love without wisdom can be destructive. Supporting someone's dreams is wonderful, but only if you're also teaching them how to support themselves. Otherwise, you're building a house with no foundation. I told him that parents need to treat their children fairly, not identically, but fairly. They need to see each child for who they are, not who they wish they'd be or who seems to need help more. Every child needs to know they matter, that their achievements are valued, that their struggles are seen. Favoritism, even with good intentions, leaves wounds that last decades. Fairness is fundamental to family love. Marcus nodded and added his own lesson, that as children, even adult children, we have to take responsibility for our own growth. He could have refused the money, gotten a job, built his career the hard way. He'd chosen the easy path and then blamed everyone else when it led nowhere. Personal responsibility matters. We can't blame our parents forever. At some point, we have to own our choices. As I drove home that day, I thought about how I'd tell this story to my own children someday, not to make their grandfather look bad or to criticize my brother, but to teach them about the complicated nature of family, love, money, and fairness. To help them understand that good intentions aren't enough, that actions have consequences, and that growth often comes through pain and difficulty. I'd tell them that their Uncle Marcus had been given everything and it had almost destroyed him, that I'd been given almost nothing and it had made me strong, that both paths had their costs and their gifts, that the real challenge in life isn't getting what you want, but learning who you are and becoming who you're meant to be. Money can't buy that. Only experience and honest self-reflection can. I'd tell them that forgiveness is possible even when the hurt runs deep, that families can heal if everyone is willing to be honest and do the work, that mistakes don't have to define us. They can refine us if we let them. That my parents, my brother, and I had all failed each other in various ways, but we'd also all chosen to do better. That choice made all the difference. Most importantly, I'd tell them that they are loved equally and unconditionally, that David and I will support their dreams while also teaching them responsibility, that we will set boundaries because boundaries are love, that we will make mistakes because all parents do, but we'll own those mistakes and try to do better, that they deserve fairness and we'll fight to give it to them, always. The story of my parents' $150,000 investment in my brother's dream life is really a story about all of us learning what matters. It's not money or success or exotic adventures or fancy equipment. It's character, resilience, honesty, fairness, and love that doesn't enable but empowers. Those are the things worth investing in. Those are the things that actually build a life worth living. A decade after that explosive Thanksgiving, my parents did regret every penny of that $150,000. But not because Marcus wasn't worth supporting, he was. We both were. They regretted it because of how they did it, the damage it caused, the lessons it failed to teach. They regretted the favoritism more than the spending. They regretted the enabling more than the amount. They regretted their own blindness most of all. But here's the thing about regret. It can be destructive or it can be instructive. My parents chose to let their regret teach them. They changed their behavior, made amends where possible, and tried to be better. That's all any of us can do. We make mistakes, we learn from them, we try to do better. We forgive ourselves and each other. We keep growing until we can't anymore. That's the work of being human. As I finish writing this story, I'm sitting in my backyard watching Emma and Jack play with their cousins, Marcus's children. My mother is sitting beside me, older now, but still sharp. Marcus and his wife are grilling dinner. David is helping them. We're all here together. This family that almost broke apart under the weight of $150,000 and years of dysfunction. But we didn't break. We bent, we struggled, we hurt each other and ourselves. But we also loved each other enough to do the hard work of healing. We were honest enough to admit our failures. We were humble enough to change. We were brave enough to forgive. And now, we're here. Imperfect, but together. Scarred, but stronger. Changed by our mistakes, but not defined by them. That's the real ending to this story. The $150,000 is gone. The years of resentment and enabling and favoritism are behind us. What remains is a family that knows itself, loves authentically, and has learned that the best inheritance you can give your children isn't money. It's wisdom, character, resilience, and the knowledge that they are loved fairly and completely. That's what we're giving our children now. That's what truly matters. So yes, my parents paid $150,000 for my brother's dream life. And yes, they regretted every penny. But in the end, that money bought us all something more valuable than any dream. The truth about ourselves, the courage to change, and the wisdom to do better. That's an expensive lesson, but one worth learning. And we learned it together, as a family. That's how this story ends. With truth, growth, and love.